Hello friends, I'm Das Food, and today we're going to do a little bit of theory crafting. You see, it's implied in the DBD lore that the general way the entity's realm works is that while there are two roles a person can be slotted into, those being survivor and killer, it's all but inevitable that all survivors will eventually end up becoming killers themselves. And why wouldn't they? While life isn't exactly easy for most killers, they have it far better than survivors, which is saying something because some killers have it pretty damn rough, like Trapper, whom the entity had to physically torment to force his loyalty, or Oni, whose mental instability is destined to be exploited by the entity for the rest of time. Despite the struggles of Trapper, Oni, and other killers, survivors definitely suffer a great deal more. They have to deal with the same mental anguish forced upon several killers, sure, but survivors also have to do this while being hunted down, stabbed, thrown on meat hooks, and consumed by eldritch spider deities. Eventually, somebody's going to break. As noble as their resilience has been, the simple fact is that the entity can do this forever, while survivors simply can't. One day, they will break. One day, they will become the very thing they fear, and it will be their chance to dish out the cruelty. But this raises an important question. Of the 31 current survivors, who is most likely to break first? While all of them undoubtedly suffer equally, I believe some are far more likely to turn to the dark side than others. Who are they? Well, let's talk about it. First and most obvious is Yunjin Lee. Everyone likely saw this one coming, and with good reason. Of all the survivors, Yunjin is the most callous, self-serving, and ruthless. While her former client, the Trickster, is unquestionably a psychopath, Yunjin may well be a bit of a sociopath herself. She doesn't care for others in the slightest, and seeks her self-preservation so strongly that such a desire is literally the name of one of her teachable perks. If the entity were to give Yunjin the chance to switch teams, does anybody actually believe she would turn it down? While it's true that she was horrified by Trickster's actions in the earthly realm, there are several things to remember with that. Firstly, she didn't know for sure that it was Trickster committing the murders, so it's not like she could confront her feelings on the matter at the time. Secondly, despite her rough upbringing, Yunjin had never experienced violence like what she saw from Trickster. Lastly, and most importantly, when it came time for Yunjin to die, she didn't show signs of fear or betrayal. Rather, she felt great anger and swore to herself to make the Trickster pay. Clearly, Yunjin has a great capacity for violence, even if it was buried far deeper within her than it is within people like, say, Kenneth the Clown Chase or Freddy Krueger. As a killer, I believe Yunjin, let's call her the producer, would be the yin to Trickster's yang, the water to his fire. Whereas Trickster is eccentric and downright gleeful as he hunts, I believe the producer would be much more akin to Michael Myers. Cold and unfeeling, I believe her icy demeanor would betray a greater truth. She not only fully understands what she's doing, but also that what she's doing will keep her from further pain. I don't believe the producer would hate Dwight, Elodie, or any other survivors, nor do I think she would do like the Doctor and revel in their pain. Instead, I think she would carry out her atrocities with a simple rationale. It's either them or me, and it's not going to be me. But, of course, Yunjin is an easy one to call, so how about I go for a more controversial pick and choose Halloween's Laurie Strode? On the surface, Laurie seems like the last person who would ever switch sides, and to some extent I do agree. If nothing else, her pure, undiluted hatred for the Shape would likely be enough to keep her from working for the same boss. But to that point, it's worth noting that the entity likely isn't fond of Myers either, seeing as though he's one of the few killers who truly operates by his own rules. In the same way that Pinhead comes and goes from the entity's realm at will, and Pyramid Head is only there due to a handshake agreement, Michael defies the killer norm in that he can't be bullied into submission. He'll put survivors on hooks if, and only if, he feels like it. And if he feels like executing the survivors by hand, well, that sucks for the entity. All of that to say, Lori working with the entity isn't out of the question, but is it in her nature to do so? Well, to answer that, I have to give a yes and a no. The no stems from the fact that Lori possesses many noble qualities that define her as being a rather virtuous person. Above all else, Laurie Strode is nurturing, protective, brave, and resilient. By all means, she's a good person. But even with that said, there's one thing about Laurie Strode that absolutely cannot be ignored. That being that she is unstable as all hell. For as good of a person as Laurie is before the night he came home, her track record after that fateful night isn't exactly great. There are multiple timelines associated with the original film, but to summarize all of them, Laurie's post-1978 outcomes can be described as follows. In one timeline, she dies right after the original Halloween 2. In the Rob Zombie films, she ends up going insane. In the continuity that ends with Halloween Resurrection, she ends up going insane. And then dying. And then, in the most recent franchise reboot, she ends up becoming a libertarian's wet dream, complete with her own compound, stocked with enough guns to help the Minutemen take back the Commonwealth. No matter the timeline, Laurie's run-in with the boogeyman always leaves her on the path to becoming a shell of a human, one who's either too afraid to lead a normal life, or entirely incapable of it. And keep in mind, this is after a single experience in which she watched her friends die. What happens when instead of a single night of horror, she's damned to an eternity of losing those she cares for? For my money, I don't think Laurie's psyche could withstand such torment. Granted, nobody's really could, but some would last far longer than others. In Laurie, I see a situation where she's taken into the fog, she bonds with Jake, Meg, and the other survivors, watches them die continuously, and eventually sees her sanity begin to slip. And unfortunately for horror's most famous final girl, even she doesn't survive this story. She will be killed, and killed, and killed, and killed, until eventually she snaps. She comes to the entity with a deal. She's willing to play ball, so long as the entity does her a favor in return. In exchange for an eternity of hunting survivors, she only needs one showdown with Michael. One long-awaited day of retribution. Whether she wins or loses the fight is irrelevant. She would get her shot at the shape that ruined her life, and that's likely all she cares about. Lastly, I want to offer another unorthodox choice of survivors turned killers. While it may be obvious to go with a literal war criminal like Jonah or an aggressive scrapper like David, I'm going to instead choose Jeff Johansson and his massive heart. You see, Jeff is a good guy, and weirdly enough, that's exactly why I believe he is a prime suspect to become a killer. More hardened individuals like Nia, Bill, and Leon are much more likely to be able to keep their cool in these situations than people like Jeff. Because for all the things that make Jeff amazing, he can't change the fact that he's far softer than many of his fellow survivors. We know from his lore that Jeff is shy, uncomfortable with confrontation, and that he feels his emotions rather strongly. He's a very empathetic person. On Earth, Jeff turned to various hobbies to keep his mind clear, but those don't apply to the entity's realm. In the fog, there are no microbreweries to design labels for, no murals to paint or gigs to play. Most importantly, there are no dogs to adopt. And for me, that's the big one. I see a great deal of myself in Jeff, and if I were put in his position, easily the hardest part for me would be knowing that my little buddy back on Earth thought I abandoned him. Jeff loved his rescued pit bull, but after his disappearance, his neighbor kicked the dog out like it was trash. Which reminds me, as a quick aside, Jeff's unnamed neighbor is the worst character, the worst, most evil character in all of DBD, and I would pay ungodly amounts of money to condemn them to a life of being hunted by vicious killers. Which, I don't know. Maybe that's not out of the question. What if Jeff could strike a deal with the entity, one where he's reunited with his prized pooch? In this situation, Jeff Johansson would become the Hound Master and hunt alongside his best friend for the rest of time. Even better, the entity could make it so that Jeff sees every survivor not as Adam or Zarina or Dwight or anything like that, but rather as the neighbor who so badly betrayed his trust. For the rest of time, he could ravage the neighbor who wronged him, making art out of their suffering. Because after all, when you hurt man's best friend, man becomes beast. And that will do it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave it a like. It helps out a lot. Also, let me know how you feel about all of this. Would your survivor main become a killer sooner than the others? And who do you think is least likely to switch sides? As always, I do want to remind you that I do stream on Twitch, das_food. Come on, stop by. It's a good time. But outside of that, we'll be back with more videos next week. Thank you so much for watching this one. I hope you are having a lovely day wherever you are. And until next time, I have been Das Food. Bye, friends.
I've been dreaming on in my head like I've seen it. A life worth living is a life with meaning. I'll do what I love till my heart stops beating. I'm feeding this demon. Got a taste, can't erase bitterness in my